The evening started as usual, until I noticed her. I had just parked my car outside the restaurant where I planned to meet my business partner, and as I walked by, I noticed a familiar figure. My heart sank when I saw her. My ex-wife, Emma, was sitting at a table with some man. He looked much older than her, with gray hair and heavy facial features. There was something strange in his eyes, a mixture of interest and slight panic, as if he realized something was wrong but couldn't stop. She sat next to him, seeming so calm and confident, as if this was her familiar scene, her place. I couldn't take my eyes off their seat together, and I felt suddenly uneasy. Memories came flooding back like cold rain. Emma had always been a woman of strong character, and her grace and confidence attracted men's attention. But why was I suddenly here, watching her with this man instead of being with her? Emma and I had divorced almost 2 years ago, but for me, those memories were still vivid, as if it had happened yesterday. I often thought about how our lives had turned out and wondered if I had done the right thing when I decided to leave. She had always been too independent, too free for me, but that didn't change the fact that I still loved her. I froze, not knowing what to do. My partner hadn't arrived yet, and I wasn't ready to date him at this point. Instead of continuing on my way, I decided to stay for a few minutes to sort out my feelings. As I got a little closer, I saw that the man with Emma didn't just look like an acquaintance of hers. Their conversation was too intimate, too personal. It gave me a strange feeling that I couldn't exactly describe. Everything inside me was fighting back, not realizing what was happening. Some time passed and I came back to reality, noticing that my business partner was already standing at the entrance of the restaurant. I smiled at him, but my thoughts were far away. It was that moment when I realized that my feelings for Emma, no matter how much I tried to suppress them, hadn't gone away. And I didn't know what I should do with that knowledge. After spotting Emma with this man, my thoughts no longer belonged to the case I was about to solve. My partner was standing in front of the restaurant, waiting to meet me, but I couldn't focus. Instead of continuing the conversation, I felt everything inside me go haywire. The situation with Emma had thrown me off balance, and I realized that it would be much more important to go home and spend the evening with her, even though I knew that this meeting with my partner in Tula was extremely important to me. But now I didn't want to be anywhere else. I just wanted to go back to the house where we had once been happy, where my relationship with Emma, despite all the problems, seemed real. I quickly dialed my partner's number and apologized, explaining that due to urgent business I wouldn't be able to make it. The man was patient and said it was okay, we could reschedule for tomorrow. He didn't ask too many questions and I was relieved to hang up the phone, feeling the tension go away. But this was weird. I canceled a meeting that could bring in money and help us expand our business, for the sake of spending the evening with Emma. Why? I still couldn't figure it out. Throwing a few papers into my bag, I walked back to the car. My thoughts kept revolving around what I had just seen. Emma with that older man. It was hard for me to calm down, but I knew I had to pull myself together. I turned my phone off so nothing would distract me on the road and focused on the fact that I needed to get home. On the way, I thought about the best way to approach this dinner, which now looked completely different to me. Would I tell her I'd seen her with this man? Or would I try to pretend that nothing had happened? I didn't know what to do. But one thing was certain, I couldn't stay the way I was. Something had broken in our lives, and I was ready to face it head-on. All that was left was to make a move and go home. As I drove into my neighborhood, I noticed several cars parked in our yard, and I was once again overcome with the feeling that something was wrong. But I decided to ignore it. Dinner with Emma, this night, might have been the only chance I had to talk, to figure out what was going on between us. As I parked outside our house, the feeling of unease never left me. It was already nightfall by the time I got back, and the darkness seemed to emphasize the atmosphere of uncertainty that hovered around me. Everything seemed the same as before, but inside me was not the same person who had left a couple hours ago. My whole world began to change, and I felt my heart clench with tension. I had always known that my relationship with Emma wasn't without its difficulties, but what I had seen in the restaurant now kept me in suspense. I drove home thinking that maybe I was exaggerating. After all, it was just a moment, a chance encounter, a misperception of the situation. But the closer I got to home, the more doubts appeared in my mind. As I pulled up, I noticed 3 unfamiliar cars parked in front of our driveway. It made me uneasy. Emma and I hadn't had a get-together with friends or family in a long time, and usually no one stayed over until late in the evening. I squinted, trying to get a good look at the license plates, but I couldn't remember anything. My heart was pounding frantically, and I could already sense that something was wrong. I parked a little further away, next to the sidewalk, so as not to attract attention. I got out of the car and, feeling my whole body tense, walked to the door. Hundreds of thoughts swirled around in my head. Why are these cars here? Who are these people? Emma always said she wanted to be alone for a while, but this was weird. I quietly opened the door and walked into the house, trying not to make any noise. The first thing I saw was 4 pairs of shoes scattered around the hallway. I knew Emma couldn't wear that many shoes at once. It was strange. Why were they all here? I froze for a few seconds, trying to make sense of the situation. As I stepped further into the living room, my hand froze on the doorknob. On the floor were leftover food, glasses of wine, and other footprints. I felt everything inside me clench. My mind was already prepared for the worst, but I still hoped for the best. I moved further inside the house, unable to control my steps or my thoughts. As I reached the stairs, I heard voices. Indistinct ones at first, then laughter. These sounds couldn't be normal. As I reached the 2nd floor, I felt the air in the house become thick and heavy. I knew this couldn't be a normal encounter, no matter how I explained it to myself. I walked to the bedroom door and froze. Through the ajar crack I saw Emma sitting on the bed with 2 men who clearly weren't supposed to be here. And one of them was her boss, a man I'd always disliked but could never understand why. He was older than her, and had always led in our company, but I hadn't expected this from her. I saw her lying on the bed, and they were enjoying her company, forgetting everything. At that moment, I felt the ground go from under my feet. The world that I thought was stable and safe was crumbling before my eyes. My wife, the woman I had been in a relationship with for almost a decade, had betrayed me. It wasn't just cheating. It was an open, shamelessly played-out situation in which I was completely disenfranchised. I wanted to scream, to burst into the room, to ruin this moment, but I knew nothing would change. They were too caught up in their act. I was left standing at the door, clenching my fists, trying not to explode in pain. Those 10 minutes I spent in this soulless scene felt like an eternity. Not knowing what to do, I decided to take the extreme step. I went downstairs to my office and found my cell. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. I felt like this moment would haunt me for the rest of my life. I needed to document everything that was happening so that I would have proof in the future. I couldn't believe what was happening, but I knew I had to be ready for anything. Gathering my strength, I went up to the 2nd floor again. I quietly snuck to the door and turned on the camera. I could see Emma and her boss enjoying the moment without me noticing. In the camera, I captured every face they made. It was the last straw. I wanted to drop the camera and walk away, but I knew it was important. I only shot a few frames because I couldn't watch it anymore. My emotions were so strong that I started to lose control. I wanted to crash, to break, and I stood there with my camera in my hands, not believing it was real. With every second I spent in that house, with every new moment I stayed in the shadows, hiding behind the door, I realized that I needed to capture everything that was happening. My hands were shaking slightly and I could barely gather my thoughts. Everything seemed so unreal, like I was in a nightmare and couldn't find a way out. I had to do this. I had to have proof to be able to make a difference later, maybe in court, maybe on the path I was about to take. Taking a few steps back, I walked downstairs to my office where an old video camera stood in the far corner. I never thought I would have to use it under these circumstances. The camera had long been forgotten, it stood there as a reminder of old family holidays and trips when our lives seemed different, when I was sure Emma was mine. Now, as I held her in my arms, the camera was my only tool for having any control over the situation. I turned the camera on and set it on the tripod, pointing the lens toward the stairs leading to the bedroom. I knew I had to be as careful as possible. If I was spotted, if I made even a second mistake, all would be lost. But I couldn't let this moment slip away. My feelings were boiling, but I knew I had to act, not let it go. Only two questions flashed through my mind: what now, and what do I do with this next? I knew that without proof, nothing would work. All these emotions I was going through now wouldn't matter if I didn't have something that could confirm my truth. I knew Emma could deny everything, like she always did. But now, with this footage, I could let her know I wasn't wrong and show everyone the truth she was trying to hide. Soon I was upstairs again, quietly approaching the bedroom. The camera was on and I stood frozen in the darkness, waiting for the moment when Emma and her lover would be in view again. I felt somehow alien in my own home, like I was an observer in someone else's movie. All I had to do was watch and film. When they started talking again, I turned the camera slightly so that it would capture not only their conversation, but also the more explicit details of what was happening. Emma's attention was completely absorbed by this man. She was talking to him as if she was in another world and I was just an empty space in her life. I couldn't help but notice the way they addressed each other. It wasn't just idle communication, but something more, something personal and intimate. I felt anger boil up in my chest. Why did I have to see all this? Why did I have to witness something that should have been hidden from anyone else's eyes? With each new moment, I felt more and more like my life was falling apart, and nothing could stop it. I was starting to think about the future, how I would relive all these moments. How would I even look at Emma if she ever came face to face with me? But in that moment, I pulled myself together. Everything was too important. It had to be wrapped up. The camera kept recording, and I was going to get everything I could out of it. I shot several video clips, capturing their faces, every detail, every word, so that there would be no doubt later about what had happened that night. I paused for a moment before I started filming again. My nerves were on edge, and I knew I wouldn't be able to continue at this pace for long. However, I didn't need anything more. I got it done. I got the shots I needed that could help me in the future. It was extremely hard, but I knew it was necessary. I quietly stepped back and turned off the camera. With every second, a struggle was happening inside of me. I was in pain and I could feel my life changing forever. In that moment, I didn't know what I was going to do with these recordings. Maybe they would prove useful to me in the future, or maybe I would never want to even look at them. But it was my choice, and I was willing to accept it. Closing the bedroom door behind me, I made my way downstairs. My body was racked with tension, I could feel the air in the house getting heavy. I didn't know how to be anymore. Only knew that everything I would do now would be determined by these frames. As I walked down the hall and closed the door behind me, it felt like the whole world had collapsed in an instant. The emotions that raged inside me were so strong that I could barely keep from destroying everything around me. I felt the anger take over me whole, like a wave, engulfing every cell in my body. This moment seemed decisive, and I knew that it would change everything I had ever known about my life, and that I was no longer destined to be the same person. The noise in the house subsided and everything around me became silent, but to me that silence was deceptive. It hit a storm inside me that I couldn't stop. I realized that I couldn't just walk away, not without doing something to express all the pain and humiliation I was feeling at that moment. I couldn't just let Emma just forget about everything, walk away from everything she had done. I needed to not only talk it out, but I needed to make her realize that she couldn't just hide like that. I burst out into the street, not noticing anything around me but the cars that were parked in our yard. They were the same cars that had brought these men in. I knew they would be leaving soon, and I couldn't let them get away without repercussions. The feeling of rage flared up again. All I could do was take my anger out on their cars. It was my way of controlling at least something in this situation. I walked over to the first car and grabbed a knife. The second I reached for the tire, I felt the weight of this act of revenge on me, but I couldn't stop. I slashed one tire, then a second, a third, all four. I knew deep down that this act would not bring me relief, but at that moment it was the only way I could express my anger. When I was done with the first car, I walked over to the second car. This car's tires were as new and expensive as the first car's. I couldn't leave them untouched. With each puncture, I could feel myself becoming more and more disconnected from what was happening around me. It was like the world was shrinking to the size of this yard, these cars, and my anger. Nothing else mattered. I was ready to do whatever it took to punish those who had betrayed me. Finished with the tires, I went back into the house and grabbed my phone. I needed to talk to Emma. I needed her to hear my voice, to realize that everything I was going through wasn't just an abstract pain, but something that couldn't go unaffected. She needed to feel my anger, my determination. I dialed her number and started calling. My heart was beating in my chest like crazy and my hands were shaking slightly with excitement. She picked up the phone, and in her voice I could immediately feel her tense up. She knew I was going to call. I couldn't hold back a smile when I heard her voice, already panicked. "Hi Emma," I said quietly, trying to keep myself from screaming. "How are you doing in there?" She answered quickly, nervously. I knew she was trying to hide something she knew. I knew she understood what I had already realized. "Max, are you back already?" Her voice sounded somehow agitated, with a note of tension. I knew she was trying to be calm, but she couldn't hide anything from me. "Yes, I'm back," I said, not hiding the irony in my voice. "You know, I always thought our life was stable. I always believed I could trust you, Emma. But that was until I saw what you were doing. You think I don't understand? You think I don't know what happened here today? You're not even trying to hide your cheating anymore." I heard her sigh, clearly trying to collect her thoughts. "Max, please, you've got it all wrong." Her voice became softer, like she was trying to reassure me, but I knew her words didn't make sense. "No, Emma, everything is right," I interrupted her, not letting her continue. "You and those men. I saw the way you behaved. You can't tell me anything. You thought I'd never find out, didn't you? You didn't think of the consequences when you invited them here." At that moment, I felt my anger begin to turn to even deeper frustration. I wasn't just angry, I was destroyed by this betrayal. I wasn't even interested in what she would say in response. I knew her excuses were as empty as anything she'd said to me before. "You're trying to cover your tracks, aren't you? You think you can forget all of this so easily? You tried to hide, but I won't let you. I know you tried to leave before I got home, but you didn't make it. I knew you were deceiving me." Silence in response. I knew she was trying to think of something, but it was too late now. All I felt was anger. Anger at her, at all these men who were trying to destroy what we were building. But worse than that, I was disappointed in myself. Why didn't I see this before? Why didn't I see what was happening under my nose? You think I'm just gonna let you go, Emma? You think you can walk away from this as if nothing happened? You're wrong. You won't be able to hide anymore. You're gonna hear what I'm telling you. There will be consequences. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but one thing was certain, I wouldn't stay silent. Emma had to realize that her actions would not go unheeded. I stood at the door with my phone in my hand, emotions boiling inside of me. I felt tears of hurt and anger almost burst out, but I held them back, knowing that wasn't what I needed right now. I needed something more decisive. I couldn't put up with this anymore. I wasn't going to let them walk away as if nothing had happened, as if their betrayal could be erased with one smile and an apology. I took a deep breath, gritting my teeth, and dialed the police number. My heart pounded in my chest like a frantic beat. I knew it was probably an extreme step, but I couldn't let things go without consequences. This wasn't just disappointment, it was the complete destruction of everything I knew and loved. I couldn't just let her go. I couldn't let her go on with her life as if nothing had happened. When I heard the operator's voice, I said as calmly as possible, "Hello, I need to report a violation urgently. My wife has cheated on me with several men and they are in my house. I want them arrested for trespassing on private property and for what they have done in my home. This happened tonight. There was an instant response on the other end of the line. The operator excitedly verified the address and then informed me that the police would be on their way within minutes. I felt relief, but it was short-lived. Everything was now in the hands of the law. I didn't know how this would end, but I knew one thing: I needed to show Emma that her actions wouldn't go without consequences. I couldn't leave it as if nothing had happened. My mind raged with thoughts. How will I live with this knowledge now? How would I look at her, at these men who had come into my life? I knew that no amount of revenge would bring back what I'd lost. But I needed her to realize, she couldn't destroy me and just walk away. I wouldn't let her leave without consequences. I stood at the window and waited. I could hear cars pulling up to my house. Suddenly the silence was broken by a noise that got louder and louder. It was the police. They had arrived. I heard them get out of their cars and head for the front door. A couple seconds later, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and saw two policemen. One was a middle-aged man with a serious expression, the other was a woman, younger, with a friendly look. They introduced themselves and I immediately began to explain the situation. Everything was very calm, but I knew this was just the beginning. There are people in the house who are trespassing on my private property, I said firmly. My wife is cheating on me and these men were here with her. I want them arrested. The police officers listened carefully and agreed to do a background check. I showed them the video I had made. Their faces changed as they watched the tape. The policewoman wrinkled her nose and the man looked like he was trying to keep his cool, but I knew it was clear. This scene I had recorded left no doubt. After a few minutes, the police officers began to head towards the bedroom where the men were. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, tensely watching them go up the stairs. Time dragged on, and I couldn't look away from the window, nor could I look away. I heard footsteps, the voice of a policeman, and then silence. A couple minutes later, the policeman came back into the living room with one of the men who was obviously Emma's boss. I couldn't look him in the eye. It was like a betrayal I had to endure. He tried to say something, but the police officers paid no attention to him, acting as if they were absolutely certain of what they were doing. I saw Emma standing in the doorway of her bedroom, her face pale and her eyes avoiding my gaze. In that moment, she realized she could no longer hide the truth. I was here, and her lies no longer had any power. The policewoman turned to Emma to ask what was going on. She remained silent. I could see how nervous she was, how she tried not to look at me, but I knew she was already trapped. All she could do was admit her guilt. I felt everything stir inside me. Frustration, anger, resentment. I looked at her and couldn't believe she'd done such a thing. But now that everything was revealed, it all became clear. She knew her deception would be exposed, but maybe she thought I wouldn't have the strength to do it. The policewoman turned to her again. We see that you have broken the law, violated someone else's private property, and participated in treason. This is a serious offense and you will have to testify. At this point Emma spoke softly. Yes, I invited them. I know it's wrong, but it was my decision. I made a mistake. I don't know how to explain it. I apologize. Her confession was like a cold shower. I stood there, unmoving, not knowing what I should do next. I didn't expect her to admit her guilt so quickly. I thought she would struggle, that she would lie. But no, she admitted everything. And now I had to figure out how to move forward. The police officers recorded her confession, and after a while they called for backup to take all the men to the station. Emma was left standing in the corner, crying quietly, and I could feel her world crumbling right in front of me. When the police officers left, I was left alone in the house. Everything that was happening was like a nightmare that I couldn't stop. Emma sat in the corner, silent, her eyes full of regret. But I didn't care. It couldn't erase what had been done. After the police took all the men away, I was left in an empty house. It seemed like it was all wrapped up, the investigation had begun and I could relax, but instead I was overcome with thoughts. I was sitting in the living room, and night had already fallen outside the window. Only the faint light of a lamp illuminated the room, and I realized that all my strength was gone. I could feel no relief, no joy, no satisfaction at what I had accomplished. Everything was empty. It brought me no peace. Taking my camera, I reviewed the footage. It was hard. I couldn't understand what exactly this tape was giving me. Each scene involving Emma and her lovers raised new questions in my mind, and each viewing only added to the pain. I lacked the words to describe the feelings I was experiencing. At first I thought it would be helpful, that it was just footage to show to a lawyer and it would be over. But now I realized that it wasn't just footage, it was my life. Every image on the screen was like a stab to my soul. Every frame of Emma sitting next to that man, her gaze, her gestures, all of it was foreign to me now. Everything I knew and loved now took on a completely different meaning. It was as if this was not my wife, not the woman I had shared decades with, but a complete stranger. I saw the way she behaved with this man, and that image was beginning to warp all my memories of her. I wanted to erase this moment from my life, erase everything that had happened here, but I couldn't. I was doomed to relive it over and over again. Finished with the camera, I picked up her phone. This was the next step, and I couldn't back out. As I checked her messages and emails, I was overcome with anxiety, as if I was invading someone else's life. Every file, every chat, every email felt like a knife cutting me from the inside out. In one of the messages, I noticed her conversation with some woman, Ira, who appeared to be a close friend of hers. I opened the correspondence. I think this has to be over. I can't go on living with this man. He doesn't understand me. But I need more time to finally break this union, she wrote. Reading those words, I felt my inner world crumbling. I couldn't believe that she had hidden her feelings from me for so long. With each new message I realized that she was ready to leave, that everything I thought about our life was a lie. I was blind as wax, melting under the warmth of her false words. It wasn't a mistake. It was her choice. And maybe I was just too naive to realize it sooner. In another message, she wrote to Ira. I don't know what to do. I mean, he's so good, but something inside of me isn't right anymore. He and I don't live like we used to anymore. I can't bring myself to love him again. And the men that come into my life, they're all I need. It gives me strength. But I need him not to know anything. I mean, he'll never understand. Reading those words, I was simply destroyed. I was naive, I was hopeful, I believed in us. But she had chosen this path a long time ago, and I was just a part of her past life. I always thought we were a team, that we could survive any hardship, that everything could be fixed. But it turns out I was just part of her game. A game with my feelings, with my trust. I was the one she was building her visibility with, but in reality, she had been somewhere else for a long time. In one of her last letters, I discovered even more horrifying things. She was telling her friend in detail how she planned to completely sever our relationship, how she wanted to take away everything I had, my car, my house, even my money. All she wanted was to be independent. In this letter, she told me that several men had offered her a large sum of money for her silence and that she had already made up her mind, she would get everything she wanted and she wouldn't look back again. I clutched the phone in my hands. I felt dizzy. This was too much to bear. I thought I could handle this situation, that I could survive the betrayal. But now I realized that everything I was going through was just a lie. It was far worse than I could have imagined. Not only had she betrayed me, but she had used me for her own gain, to get whatever she wanted, while completely ignoring my feelings and my pain. But I couldn't stop. I started reading more of her posts, looking for every detail, every word that could clarify what was really going on in her life. And lo and behold, I came across pictures she was sending to one of her lovers. I couldn't believe that these things were happening right in front of my eyes. She was ready to tear me apart for her own pleasure. I felt like an alien being in her life. Unable to watch this anymore, I threw the phone on the table. Everything I was feeling was now unbearable. I didn't know how I was supposed to go on. It was like a disaster. My own emotions were crumbling under the weight of what I had just learned. And everything I had been going through seemed meaningless to me now. I was sure that I could have fixed everything, that it was possible to get it all back. But now I saw that it was impossible. Everything was long lost, and I couldn't get it back. I couldn't stop thinking about how she had manipulated me. How she used my trust and affection. It wasn't just cheating, it was betrayal at the highest level. She had destroyed me, and now I realized that I couldn't go back to being the person I used to be. Everything I loved had turned out to be a lie, and I didn't know how to live with that. My thoughts kept going back to what I had seen in the videos, what I had read in her messages. I couldn't forget it. I couldn't forget her hypocrisy and cruelty. I was willing to do whatever it took to figure out what had happened, but now I knew that even if I got all the answers, it wouldn't change what had happened. I had lost her, I had lost myself and my faith in people. The next day, after I finished analyzing all of Emma's materials and correspondence, I decided that I needed to see a lawyer. I didn't know what to do with the feelings that were overwhelming me, but I knew for sure that I couldn't just accept it. I had to take action. I had to find a way to get at least some part of my life back. And to do that, I needed to find out every possible legal avenue. I called Alex, an old friend of mine who was also an excellent lawyer. We had known each other for a long time, and I always knew I could count on him. We agreed to meet at his office, and I was ready for a conversation that, knowing his character, promised to be frank and direct. 1,000 thoughts were running through my mind. I was sure that despite all the pain I was feeling, I needed to keep my cool, because the future was being decided in these moments. Alex had always been not only a lawyer to me, but also a friend. He was a man who always told the truth, even if it was bitter. I knew his opinion would be important, and I expected to hear harsh but necessary words. When I entered his office, he was sitting at his desk, staring at papers. I noticed immediately that he was serious. His eyes, used to complex cases, were focused and his face expressed concern. He stood up as I approached and immediately offered me a seat. "Max, I'm listening to you," he said, without further ado, inviting me to start the conversation. His tone was cold as always, but I could see in his eyes that he understood that this meeting was not going to be easy. I sat down and, closing my eyes for a second, began to talk. "I don't know where to start," I said, a little stammered. "Everything I'm going through can't just be digested. You've seen the tapes I brought, and the correspondence I found. This isn't just cheating. It's deceit, betrayal. I've lost everything I had. My trust, my life. She did it on purpose. She chose a path that brought everything down." Alex listened intently, his face remained emotionless, but I knew he was taking in every word. He didn't interrupt me, just leaned forward a little when I finished. "Max, I understand that you're worried. But let's get to the point. You're saying it's cheating, that she betrayed you. That's the legal side of it. First you have to understand what you want to get out of it. Divorce is just the beginning. Do you want to take everything she had? Or do you want to get something else?" I thought about it. My mind was all jumbled up and it was hard to clearly articulate my intentions. All I knew was that I couldn't just let her go. I had to fight, but how? "I want justice," I said, unable to contain the rage in my voice. "I want her to realize that everything she's done won't go without consequences. But not just her. I want to punish all these men who were part of her game. This wasn't just cheating. This was the willful destruction of my life, and I can't let it go unchecked." Alex nodded, thinking how best to formulate our next steps. "Okay," he said, "you're right to point out that in order to get justice, we need to get our legal strategy right. I think we should start with the divorce. You can sue for property division, alimony, and moral damages. But that's as far as she's concerned. The men she cheated on you with are a separate issue. You can sue them for moral damages, for violation of your rights, but for that we need to collect evidence. I stood up and started pacing nervously around the room. The thought of suing the people who had ruined my life seemed like the right thing to do, but I knew I needed to be prepared for it to be a long road. What would it look like? I asked. How will I be able to prove all of this? It's not like I can just show them the camera footage I took myself. Alex looked up and said discreetly. We'll rely on your evidence, of course. The video is the foundation, but we need more to establish the facts. If you want to win your case against these men, we'll need to prove that their actions harmed you, that they weren't just random participants in her life, but were knowingly involved in her plan. I think this can be proven through witness testimony and the correspondence you have. We would need to provide evidence that they knew she was married, that her relationship with you was stable, and that it was all happening against the backdrop of your trust. I was relieved. Alex knew what to do. We were ready to begin. But there was still a heavy weight in my chest. I knew it was going to be a long process, full of pain, nerves, and frustration. We talked for a long time more, discussing every step, every possible option to win the case. Alex was confident that we could succeed, but I realized that each new discovery, each new piece of evidence would bring me more and more pain. When the meeting was over, I thanked Alex for his support, for his advice, and went home feeling the pressure mounting. Everything I had just heard made me realize that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that I would have to make decisions that would be painful but necessary. And while I didn't yet know exactly how I would experience all of this, I knew one thing: I had to fight for my life, for my honor, and for my future. Emma may have thought it would be easy, that she could just walk away, but I wouldn't let her walk away without consequences. For a few days after I met with the lawyer, I had to be alone with my thoughts. I didn't know where to start, or how best to construct my plan. But despite all the pain I was going through, I realized that I needed to take action. Everything that was happening in my house, the betrayal, the cheating, the manipulation, it was all going to have consequences. And I wasn't going to stay silent. I wanted them all to be held accountable for their actions. Emma, her lovers, and those behind it all had to pay. When I learned that these men weren't just casual acquaintances of Emma's, but important figures in the business, I knew I had to act decisively. These men had violated not only my personal boundaries, but my business boundaries as well. Emma was obviously using her connections and her influence to manipulate and capitalize on me and my life. I couldn't just leave it at that. My lawyer said now was the time to act, not only on the personal front, but also on the business front. It was necessary to go out to these men to demand compensation, and I knew that this would be the first step to a legal battle that could be a rather difficult but necessary process for me. I was ready for it. I had to get back at least something. As it turned out, 2 of these men were major clients of the company I worked for, and one was an important partner in it. This was another unexpected milestone in my journey. I realized that their behavior wasn't just about personal boundaries. They had violated everything. They had stepped into my life as if it were someone else's property, without thinking of the consequences. And now I needed to let them know that they wouldn't get away with it without punishment. I called my lawyer and let him know what I'd learned. Alex was wary, but also interested in me continuing my fight. We decided that he would send legal letters to these men and their companies demanding compensation. I was ready to go all the way, despite the emotional heaviness I was feeling. A few days later, I received documents from Alexa that needed to be signed. They demanded compensation for moral damages for betrayal and violation of personal rights. I signed them without hesitation, knowing that this was the first step towards justice. I wasn't prepared to wait for Emma and her lovers to just step back into the shadows, forgetting about me. I had to hold them accountable for their actions. Soon the lawyer informed me that the first of these businessmen had agreed to meet to discuss compensation. His name was Pierre, and he was one of Emma's most influential clients, as well as part of the very same shadowy network in which she revolved. He'd been in the business a long time and knew how to cover his tracks. But things were different now. I knew that if I didn't make moves now, I would look weak. And I wasn't ready to let that happen. I decided to meet Pierre at one of the restaurants he frequented. I had prepared in advance for the conversation, and all I had to do was go there and demand what was owed to me. My inner conflict was at an all-time high, but I knew I had to talk tough with this man. When I entered the restaurant, Pierre was already seated at a table. He looked up, and his gaze immediately became more wary, as if he knew this meeting was not going to be an easy one. I walked over to him, sat across from him, and got straight to the point. "Pierre, you probably realize why I called you in," I said, not giving him a chance to start talking. He was silent for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts, and then nodded. "I understand," he replied, but his voice was unsure. "But, Max, you have to realize that." I interrupted him, not wanting to hear his excuses. "I didn't come here to hear excuses. You, like her, didn't bother to think about the consequences. Did you think I wouldn't find out what was going on? Did you think you could just get away with it?" Pierre glanced nervously at his coffee cup, then looked at me again. "I understand your frustration, Max. But you have to realize that he started, but I interrupted him again. "You don't understand, Pierre," I said, and my voice became much firmer. "You and the others who were with her, you must pay for your actions. I can't get back everything I've lost, but I can make you suffer the consequences. And I demand compensation. Moral damages. Do you understand what I mean?" His gaze clouded over, and I could see his confidence begin to melt. Pierre was a man who was used to having his words carry weight, but now he found himself on the other side. He tried to maneuver, but I already knew I wasn't going to let him get away with it. "Max, let's not make this any harder than it has to be. We can negotiate some kind of human settlement. Maybe we can find a solution that works for both of us." He tried to offer a compromise, but I knew his words were just an attempt to delay the inevitable. I didn't let him continue. "There will be no more decisions, Pierre. You and your company must pay for what happened. I'm not going to let it go unchallenged. If you think you can just disappear like that and hide behind your money, you're wrong." I noticed his face turn pale. He felt the pressure that was coming from me. He realized that I wasn't kidding, and that his options to manipulate the situation were exhausted. "Okay," he said with a heavy sigh. "I'm ready to negotiate. You make the demands, we'll see what we can do." I nodded and stood up. "I'll put them forward through my lawyer, and we'll move on. But know one thing, Pierre, this is for a reason. This is the end of your games." As I left the restaurant, I knew this conversation was just the beginning. But for me, it wasn't just a demand for compensation. It was a step toward restoring my dignity, a step toward regaining at least some of what I had lost. I was willing to fight, despite everything I had been through. My life wasn't over, and I wasn't going to let these people break me. A few days after meeting Pierre, my anxiety only grew. I knew that these men and their company were not the last links in the chain that had brought me here. Emma had manipulated not only me, but everyone around her, and now I knew that her betrayal affected far more than just her personal life. It was becoming clearer by the day that all of these people were not just random participants in her life, but important figures in her network who were using her, and therefore me. Alex, my lawyer, told me that after I sued Pierre and his company, it turned out that there was another person involved in the story, the owner of the tennis club Emma frequented. This was a man I didn't know personally, but had often heard his name in conversation with friends. Harry, the owner of the club, appeared to be much more connected to Emma than I could have imagined. When I found out that Harry was not only a businessman, but also a friend of Pierre's, I knew I had to meet him. I knew his reputation in business was important, and he couldn't let his name get caught up in a scandal. I needed to talk to him, to find out how far he was willing to go in supporting Emma. I was sure he couldn't have been so naive as to not realize how his actions could affect his club and his business. I contacted Alexam and told him about Harry. We decided that we needed to meet him at his club, somewhere he felt in his element. Harry knew I would be there and our meeting was set for that evening. I was ready, but at the same time I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was lurking behind this meeting. This was the moment when I had to decide if I was willing to go all out for revenge and compensation. When Alex and I arrived at the tennis club, I felt everything inside of me clench. This was the place where Emma had spent quite a bit of time, and now I was standing here to meet the man who was connected to her betrayal. We entered the club and headed towards the meeting room. Harry was already seated at a table when we entered. He met us with a look that I couldn't exactly read, but I knew he understood. This meeting wasn't going to be easy. Harry stood up as we approached his desk and held out his hand as if nothing had happened. But I was in no mood for politeness. We sat down, and I got straight to the point. "Harry," I said, wasting no time with unnecessary phrases, "you know why I'm here. And you realize that your name could be at the center of this scandal." He was silent for a few seconds, trying to choose words to start the conversation, but I continued. "You were aware of everything that was going on with Emma. You knew she was married, you knew it was ruining my life, but you still let her continue to manipulate you and your club. I will not tolerate my world being destroyed by people who have zero respect for my boundaries." Alex sat next to me, silently observing the situation. He knew how hard it was for me to talk to this man, but he also knew that I needed to do it. Harry was an important figure, and we needed to convince him that we were not to be trifled with. Harry finally spoke, but his voice was shaky. "Max, I didn't mean for it to turn out this way," he began. "I knew Emma was married, but to be honest, I didn't know it would have these consequences. I can't interfere with her personal life. We had a business relationship, and, I can't just plead guilty to what happened." His words made no impression on me. I could see him trying to justify himself, trying to cover up his guilt, but I wasn't interested. I knew it was all nothing more than business to him, but to me it was a matter of honor. "You're telling me this was all an accident? You didn't realize she was manipulating you and everything else? You knew full well how many people depended on your club. You knew it would affect your reputation, the reputation of your business. But you kept letting her use you. I don't think it was an accident, Harry. Do you realize that now you have to take responsibility for all of this?" He was visibly tense, but still trying to remain calm. "Max, you don't understand," he began, but I interrupted him. "No, Harry, I do understand. You and Emma have played your game and now it's time for you to pay. You put your reputation and the reputation of your club on the line, and now you have to pay for your actions. I want compensation, and if you think I'm just going to walk away, you're wrong." Alex stood up and his voice became firmer. "Harry, you can't hide from responsibility. We are ready to act. If you don't agree to our terms, we will be forced to sue, and believe me, the case will not end only with moral damage. We'll be seeking damages as well. This could be very damaging to your reputation. We won't leave you alone if you continue to refuse." Harry realized that the situation was getting out of control. He exhaled slowly and his face became less confident. I saw his gaze become less determined. "Okay," he said, finally giving up. "I'll settle for compensation. How much do you want?" Alex and I exchanged glances. We knew this was just the beginning, and we had to go all the way. "I'm not going for minimum terms, Harry," I replied. "You're going to lose more than you realize. I want you to realize that your name and the name of your club are now at stake. You're going to pay us the amount that will make up for the loss, and you're going to do it publicly. If you don't, I promise you will lose not only your reputation, but everything you have built." Harry felt his position weaken and he began to look for options. He agreed to our demands, but I knew his decisions would not be final. We couldn't stop. We were ready to act, and now we had everything we needed to get justice. After meeting with the tennis club owner and discussing the next steps with my lawyer several times, there finally came a moment in my life when I realized that all of these steps were just preparation for the most important event, meeting Emma. After everything that had happened, after her betrayal had opened up a whole new world in front of me, I knew that this meeting would be crucial. Not so much for her, but for me. I knew I had to meet her and put a stop to our past. But I had to do it with dignity. And I knew that this meeting could not be ignored or postponed. For weeks now, I had been trying to cope with what had happened. I had hoped that in time the pain would lessen, that the wound would heal, but it wasn't happening. Each new day away from her brought only more questions than answers. I was still attached to her, despite everything that had happened. But what tormented me the most was the thought that everything I believed in was a lie. And despite my best efforts, I needed to see her again. In person. I needed to feel that I wasn't just standing on this path for nothing, that I hadn't gone through all these trials for nothing. My heart squeezed when I saw her in that restaurant. It wasn't the restaurant where she and I usually met, but I knew she went there often with a new man. It was her new world, and I knew that I was about to become a part of it. Emma was already at the table next to him, the new man she had been playing her games with for so long. I didn't know who he was, but I felt that there was something in his gaze that echoed what I had seen before in her eyes. It wasn't just an encounter, it was a collision of two worlds. I took a few steps and, as if intentionally slowing my stride, approached their table. Emma noticed me immediately, her face pale and her hand frozen as she tried to take a sip from her glass. I noticed her anxiety, her confusion, her attempt to control the situation, but it didn't matter so much anymore. She could have tried to justify herself, but I knew words didn't matter now. All that was left was looks and actions. The man next to her noticed me first and stood up, offering his hand in greeting, but I didn't take it. All I could do at this point was watch him and her. Emma was silent for a moment, not knowing what to say. The man appeared tall and well-groomed, with a confident expression on his face, as if he was used to everyone paying attention to him. He was older than me, maybe 10 years older, but that didn't matter. It wasn't about age, it was about what he represented to her now. He was part of her new life and I was just her past, which she hoped she had put behind her. "Max, you're here," she said, but there wasn't the warmth in her voice that I remembered. It was just cold fact, no joy or regret. I could feel her trying to hide something, but her eyes gave her away. I could see her feeling insecure. I nodded silently and sat down at the table across from her. The man sat down as well, but his presence seemed unnecessary. We weren't here to discuss his place in her life, we were here to consummate everything that had once bound us together. I knew this moment would be the final point of our past. "How are you feeling?" I finally spoke, looking directly into her eyes. It was a simple question, but I knew there was a lot lurking beneath it. I wasn't naive, I knew that everything that had been between us no longer mattered to her. But I was still here to look into her eyes, to see how she reacted. She was quiet for a bit before she answered, but I already knew what she was going to say. It was all part of her script, part of the image she'd spent so long building. Okay, she said, not meeting my gaze. I noticed her hand shaking as she placed her glass on the table. "Max, you shouldn't have come here." Her words were full of regret, but that didn't change the point. I could see her and feel her trying to control the situation, trying to save face again. But now I knew there was nothing behind that mask anymore. I could no longer trust what she was saying. "You're right," I said, "I shouldn't have come here. But I needed to see you. I needed to understand what happened. You destroyed everything we were building. You betrayed me, and now I see you living with it. I'm not the one who lost everything, Emma. You did." Her face grew even paler, and I could see her trying to hold herself together. The man sitting next to her couldn't understand what was happening. He felt the tension and didn't seem to know what to do. He looked at her, then at me, but said nothing. I continued. "You always said you loved me. You said I was your rock, that you and I would get through anything. And now I see that was just a lie. You used me, you manipulated my feelings. You weren't thinking about us, you were only thinking about yourself." Emma raised her eyes and finally looked me in the face. I saw her eyes fill with tears, but it didn't matter now. She was still in this world where there was no room for me. "I didn't mean for this to happen," her voice was quiet, almost inaudible. "I didn't know it would go this far. It was hard for me, Max, you didn't understand. You didn't hear me. I couldn't go on living the way I used to. I didn't listen to her excuses anymore. I knew those words meant nothing. She had found a new way to live, a new way to be happy, and I was no longer a part of it. You didn't just ruin us, I said, looking straight into her eyes, you ruined your life. You destroyed everything you and I built. And now when you look at me, you don't see the same person you were with. You see a stranger. She didn't answer. Just sat there looking at me in silence. I knew she was going through all of this, but I didn't care anymore. I wasn't here to comfort her or make excuses. I was here to end this phase of my life. I stood up from the table, looking around at both of them. Emma tried to say something, but I interrupted her. Goodbye, Emma, I said, and this time there was no pain in my voice, no tears. There was only relief. It was the final point. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving her and her new man behind me. I was no longer the person to suffer through this betrayal. I was free. As I walked out of the restaurant, the air seemed unusually clear. It wasn't just a walk, but a moment of liberation. Everything that had happened over the past few months seemed now part of someone else's life. I was no longer the person who had suffered from betrayal, from lies and deceit. I was free now, but that freedom did not come without pain. It was a painful but necessary change. With every step I took, I could feel everything that was left of that life fading into the past. Emma, her manipulations, her relationships with these men, none of it mattered anymore. I had survived this moment, I had survived her betrayal, and now I was ready to move on. Everything that had been between us vanished as soon as I said those words, goodbye. They didn't sound like forgiveness, but a final point, a step into a new life. I turned on my camera to complete the recording, not just to leave this video as a testimony, but as a reminder to myself that I had gotten through this. It wasn't just forgiveness, it was acceptance. I could no longer allow myself to live in the past. Everything I had experienced no longer defined me. I am taking a step into a new life, and even though it may not be what I envisioned, it will be mine. This video isn't just about what happened. This video is about how I survived betrayal and how I learned to let go. I realized that everything that happened made me stronger. And now I see that each of us is not just a victim of circumstances. It is up to us to decide what to do with what happens to us. With this video, I conclude my story. It is not the end, but the beginning of a new journey. A path where I will learn to be strong, to be independent, to be free. And I leave you with this message: don't be afraid to forgive, don't be afraid to move forward, even if it means leaving behind everything you once loved. Forgive and move forward, because life goes on.